And with your philosophy now, can you talk about emerging strategies and that concept from your coaching philosophy? What holes you were seeing in the training process that led you to the way that you coach now?
Yeah, I would say before 2014 or 15, somewhere in there. I mean, I was programming training pretty much like everyone else. We follow, uh, there's several different periodization models, but they're all kind of the same thing. Like we have linear periodization, and people want to argue over linear versus block. And well, like block is kind of linear that's compressed down into a shorter time scale. And, okay, cool. And anyway, if we go back further than that, there was a guy who used to write a blog, a fitness related blog. His name was Matt Perryman. And he wrote a book at one point called Squat Every Day. And this was kind of when powerlifting was going through its Bulgarian style training infatuation, like tends to happen every decade or so. Um, anyway, he always struck me as a really clear thinker, really had good insights on these things. Anyway, he sent me a copy of his book, and one of the things that he talked about in his book was problems with a top-down planning model, which is what basically every periodization model is. We're going to start with the quadrennial and break it up into annual plans, and all the way down to the training session. So this training session is a tiny little brick that fits in this giant house that you're building toward the peak of your athletic potential, and we're going to plan all this out in advance, basically. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, and I think a lot of us, basically everybody who writes training for athletes, sees the problems with this. That these things are not predictable, and there's even to the point of predicting more than a few weeks in advance. Like you don't incorporate emerging information. You don't incorporate all this additional data that's coming back into you through these feedback processes, and you've got cognitive biases working against you and so on. So anyway, there's these problems with a top-down approach, and our approach tends to be, we'll plan for shorter and shorter periods. Like I've heard coaches say, well, I only plan 3 weeks at a time, I only plan 4 weeks at a time. And I think that mitigates a lot of the problems, but probably doesn't solve them completely. Anyway, Matt in his book is talking about these problems with a top-down planning approach, and I thought, that's really smart. Well, what would a bottom-up approach look like? And I had no idea, and I kind of got stuck there for a couple years, until at one point I was listening to an interview with Derek Evely, who worked as a throws coach under Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. And again, I'll kind of cut through some of the story here, but I'm listening to him talk about how they prepared shot putters, hammer throwers, and I'm thinking, that's a bottom-up approach. That's what it would look like. And I began the process of trying to translate that into powerlifting, and basically what you get from there is this concept of emerging strategies, which just kind of a rough outline. You design one microcycle, one single unit of training. Now, in traditional powerlifting parlance, a microcycle is going to be one training week, and that's a great place to start. It's important to point out it doesn't have to be. For example, in the hammer throw, those guys have one training session, and that single training session constitutes the entire microcycle. Now, it's not one session per week. They're doing that session every day, but at that point they're running a training microcycle every day. The way that microcycle is being defined here is kind of one unit of training that repeats. So that's fine. Start with a training week if that's easier to wrap your mind around. So it's 1 week of training. You do that, and then you come back the next week and you do it again. Same exercises, same sets, same reps, same RPE. So the load on the bar can adjust based on your performance, which hopefully you're getting stronger, so the load goes up a little bit. But you want the dose of training to be the same. And what you're doing is just looking to see what happens, and you notice that athletes tend to have usually one of 3 types of responses. Sometimes they just get better, from week 1 to week 2, they get a little better, and then so on. Sometimes there's a dip in performance in week 2, and then a subsequent rise for a while. Then the third type is kind of this stagnant, like no real up or down movement for a few weeks, and then sometimes like a small dip and a big rise, or sometimes no small dip, but a big rise. So you get one of these 3 response types. The performance at some point goes up, and then at some point it stops going up, and that's what you're looking for. You're looking for this peak condition. And what you want to, first, once you hit that peak condition, that's when it's time to change something. So you're repeating this microcycle over and over, and you're monitoring the results. And as long as you're getting better, then you keep going. Then when you stop getting better, you change something. You go kind of the way that we do it most of the time, like 99% of the time, is we go into what we call a pivot block. Think of it like a deload for right now. It's roughly 1/3 the length of the development block. So if you spent 6 weeks in the development block, then you'll have a 2-week-long pivot. It's not like some people think of they hear the word deload and they think, well, I'll screw around the gym for 30 minutes and then I'll go home. It's not exactly that. It's still training. It's just not hardcore, single-minded, get stronger training. It's more diverse. It's more generalized. Anyway, so you go through this pivot, and then you go into another development cycle that's different from the first one. Okay, simple enough. But what this does, it allows you to start to see what is producing results for you. Because each development cycle that you would do a block review. You would take note of what you did and what the results were. So you do a few development cycles, and then you start to look at these block reviews, and you go, hey, all my best training blocks are done when I'm, at 80 to 85% intensity, or they all include pin squats, or whatever. There could be lots of different things. And then you start to piece together this picture of what does the athlete respond best to. Then when you come close to a competition, you start to pull those block reviews and replay your greatest hits, replay the things that you have the most justification for as far as producing results for that athlete. And then that's kind of where the name emerging strategies comes from, because the long-term plan emerges from the short-term plan. There's not really this top-down imposition of what the long-term is going to look like. We're just going to let it grow.